Hello, this is Coach Matt from Coach Matt's Online Chess Academy. And today we're going to do a very exciting video talking about this one over here known as the F pawn. Now, some of you say to me, well, Coach Matt, what is so amazing about this F pawn, these two F pawns on the board? Well, the reason why these are so important is because when you start a chess game, only the king defends that particular square. And that's also the same thing true with the king over here for white. If you notice the pawns on the E square, they're being defended by the bishop, by the knight, they're being defended by the king, and by the queen. And the one on the D square is also being guarded by a knight, by a bishop, by a queen, and by a king. And obviously the same is true for black. So because only the king guards it, it means the king is in a situation where it must capture whatever it is or must deal with the issue of that attack. So first I'm going to show you a very interesting position that could happen if you decide to move your f pawn out too early in the game. If white plays the move f4 and black responds with e6 and white plays g4, now we've achieved something that is amazing. This next position that's coming out is actually going to be just a checkmate in just two moves. Game is already over the game because now the queen is attacking the king and the king has nowhere to escape in these positions at all. Every single square is completely out of the question. This move over here is illegal because the queen has that check. And this is checkmate, game over. This is the two-move checkmate known as the fool's mate. And this happened because white moved out his g and his f pawns out really early in the game, exposing the king to this weakness. So it's very important to make sure that you don't do that when you're playing your chess games. Now let's back up a little bit here and talk about another situation. If white plays e4 and black plays e5, and white decides to bring his queen out really early in the game, some may say, well, Coach Matt, it's bad to bring a queen out this early in the game. And you'd be correct. It is a really bad idea normally. But here, black unfortunately has some problems. If he tries to bring his knight out, for example, which is, of course, the best move guarding this pawn, his bishop can come out. And now black has a good response here, which is actually g6. But if it doesn't play g6 here and plays something like knight f6, notice how he's already been checkmated. And this is known as the scholar's mate. This is the four-move checkmate. Notice how the queen is now checking the king, and there's nowhere for the king to escape. Every single square is out of the question. He is completely in trouble here, and this is a checkmating position. Again, attacking the vulnerable f-pawn leads to these victories. Now, in today's position here, I'm going to show you one where white decided to play e4 and e5, and white played the move knight to f3. Now, some of you might say to me, well, Coach Matt, this is more realistic. This is what I think somebody would do in a chess game. And guess what? Probably is. Maybe some beginners would bring out their F pawns or their G pawns out forward, or even bring their queen out really early. But when you get a little better at chess, most players are going to try to avoid those lines because they know it's dangerous to bring those pieces out to those positions and weaken the king. So here, the knight is now attacking this pawn. So in this situation, there's many ways that black can solve this issue. The best defense is knight out to c6. This clearly guards the pawn and does not block any of the bishops from moving. It allows this pawn to potentially advance, and then that bishop back here would not be hampered from moving either. So it's just a good move overall. But in this game, black decides to ignore what we talked about and moves his f7 pawn to f6. And this move is a very, very bad move here for black. Moving the f-pawn out this early in the game has caused big time problems. White is actually able to play a miraculous move here. He can play knight takes pawn. Now, some of you say to me, well, Coach Matt, what's the story with this? Can't the pawn just take it? Well, before we talk about that, let's talk about what happens if he doesn't take the pawn. If he doesn't take the pawn, let's say he decides to attack it again. If he does that in the situation, white is going to be able to play queen h5 check. And notice how we now check the king. And this square is now covered by the knight. This square is covered by the knight. If the king retreats up to the only square, which is e7, then white is able to play checkmate. And every square is covered. There's nowhere out of it, is checkmate protected by the knight. And as you can see, that would just win the game. If he decided to block with his pawn, however, I can now take this pawn here. And then when the pawn retakes, I can just take the rook and just capture like a million guys here. It's just going to be horrible. So black's going to have a terrible time here trying to get out of this position. Now, let's go back to the most obvious move now. Earlier, and just to recap on what we did, we had the move e4 and then e5, and then we had knight f3, and then we had, of course, the move f6. So now, if I capture the pawn, we talked about what happens if he does take. And that's what you're probably all wondering. Well, he just takes the pawn. This leads to disaster. White is able to play queen h5 check, which immediately checks the king. Now, black has only two responses. One is to play pawn to g6, or one's to play king to e7. Let's talk about pawn to g6 first. So he takes his pawn of g7, goes to g6, and white responds with this really nice move. Queen takes e5 check. This not only checks the king, but also attacks the rook in the corner, creating what's known as a fork. Now, no matter what black does, whether he moves his king or he blocks with something, white's going to be able to take the rook on the next move and gain an advantage. So now let's go back a second ago and talk about, in this situation, if the king decides to move up, because we talked about just now if he blocked with a pawn, right? So if he moves up to e7, now we want to play moves that not only check the king, but do not allow black to block any of the checks. So for example, if you're thinking this is the right move here, not very good move, unfortunately, because black is able to get his knight in the game. And don't forget, you've already given up a knight. So maybe you could say, oh, I could take this pawn now, but black's going to be pretty safe for this position and be able to survive this game here. But if you just did this other move first, now the knight wouldn't be developed on the board, and you have this check, and this is the right answer. And now again, every square is covered here. The king must escape to f7, and white can now bring out another piece on the board, bishop to c4 check. And that, of course, is going to attack the king. And there's actually two responses that black can play here. If you notice, every single square is covered here with the exception of the one over here that's on g6. So that's the answer we're going to go through in a moment. But he could also bring his pawn forward. If he does this, you can do bishop takes pawn check, and it still leads to bad problems here for black. But in our game, we're going to pretend he moves his king out to g6. And if he does king g6 here, white can actually play queen f5 check. Notice how it is protected by the pawn, checking the king, controlling all of these squares. And now it's forcing black's king to make only one move, and that is king over to h6. Now, many of you that have studied chess before or watched strong players play chess, you probably realize there's something they do differently than most of the beginner players, and that is they try to develop every one of their pieces on the board. And here, white wants to bring out all of his pieces. So right now he's got, of course, a queen out, which is really good. He's got a bishop out, which is really good. But he wants to bring out some of these guys over here that are just kind of sleeping and not doing anything right now. So his next move that he's going to play is actually pawn to d4. That is going to actually create what's called a discovered attack. It's now going to check the king. And now, with the queen controlling all these squares, there's no choice for black other than to block with something. Now, there's two blocking moves. One is g5 or queen to g5. And queen g5 is just not going to work well because queen takes his mate. Now, as you can see, the bishop has it protected. It's checkmate. The king has nowhere out of this. It's just game over. So let's look at g5 because it's more practical. Now, it's going to be white's turn. And this is an opportunity now for my friends here listening to look at the board and figure out what piece do we want to get out on the board that we haven't developed yet, and how are we going to get that piece out on the board? Let's give you guys a few moments to look at that video and get some guesses what piece you're going to try to get out. Okay, so the piece you really want to get out here is the rook on h1. And you probably said to me, well, how is that rook going to get out? Well, we'll come to that in a moment. Let's look at the knight and the rook first of all. They're just stuck over here. There's no way they can do anything against this king in the next few moves. They're way too far away, right? Like this knight has to go all the way over here to like here. He's got so many different squares to get to the king, and this rook is way too far away too, right? So here he plays h4. Now this is a nice move because what it does is it unleashes the power of the rook on this file. Not only that, this pawn on g5 is actually pinned by the bishop on c1. So it cannot take the pawn without putting the king into check. And basically anything that black does is bad here. There's only a bunch of moves he can play. I mean, the obvious move of pawn takes is going to be coming. So if the king tries to escape the pawn takes g5 move, now you can actually force a checkmate in just two moves. And once again, I'll let you guys have a few moments here to figure out what the move is, the combination. It's a two-move checkmate forced that white does against black. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at it. The answer is queen f7 check, checking the king, controlling all of these squares. And then when the king decides to escape, because he cannot obviously take the queen because of the bishop, so when the king decides to escape to h6, Now we have a simple checkmate. This is going to be a check with the rook. It's going to be a check with the pawn, and the pawn's guarded by the bishop, so the queen cannot take it, nor can the king. And because it's a double check, you can't block it. The game is now over. This is checkmate, and the queen controls all these squares. So every single square is being covered here. There's nothing that black can do about this. And this is a great example of why it's very important to make sure you always defend your F7 square. So now you're saying to me, well, Coach Matt, this is all great to know, but what do I actually do in a chess game? Well, if you want to move out your F pawn, especially if you're a beginner player, I recommend that assuming black plays even some reasonable moves, that you try to initially start an opening where you're going to develop your pieces first, and then once you castle, you can potentially do that if you want to. So let's look at an opening that looks very reasonable here, like something like this Joko Piano opening here. If this position happens in the game and white's able to castle, now if black develops, you can defend, and on the next move or so, you can push this pawn out if you slide your king over to avoid the check, and then obviously if you prepare your knight out of the way. But at this point here, if you're able to, let's say the bishop moves somewhere he shouldn't move, and let's say your knight decides to move somewhere else, maybe back even to e1 for some reason. Who knows if it's the best move or not? But if this were the position here and black does kind of like a nothing move, pushing his pawn forward, then here you can actually play the move f4. And all I'm trying to demonstrate here is not necessarily this is how someone would play in a game, but just that this f pawn is now okay to move. It's now safe because here in this situation, you're able to unleash the power of this rook on this file here. Now some may say, oh, he can put a check. Okay, he can. He can play a check if he wants to. I can slide my king over. I mean, obviously this move is not going to help because the queen would take it. So there's no way to really go around it. I can use the rook now to attack this file and possibly do something. So it's never impossible to move your f pawn out. You just really want to make sure you get your king safe before you do so. And that's the end of this video. So if you guys have any questions, please go ahead and feel free to comment and let me know. And hopefully we'll see you guys next time and have a great day. Thank you.